Hi everybody, welcome to the evaluation webinar series, session number 5 on budgeting for evaluation and what to consider. As you know, I am Sue Hyatt with Big Purpose, Big Impact, and I have the privilege of being your trainer for this whole series. I see Kat did just join, so I'm going to unmute her because I think she wanted to say a couple things. So let me see if I can get that done. Well, unmute Kat Keene. There we go. I guess that's in process. Kat, can you hear me? And
yes, I think so. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I just wanted to say a quick word of welcome and appreciation for this webinar series. I think this webinar today is one of the more important ones when we're talking about budget. So as a quick reminder, the previous webinars and the materials are available on our website. And really want to appreciate Sue and the work that she's put into templates, which are all relevant as you reapply or continue your funding applications this week. So thank you, Sue, and thanks everyone who joined the webinar.
Thanks, Kat. I will try to put her back on mute. There we go. Okay, so as Kat said, budgeting for evaluation I think is often well, it's an important topic, but I also think it's kind of a scary one because there's lots of fear that people have around, well, we can't really afford this, and I'm not sure how to even start thinking about how much to allocate for an evaluation, all of those kind of things. So I think it's really great and very good timing, especially for those of you that are about to put your grant application in later this week, to go over some tips and strategies on budgeting and really identifying some of the things that you need to think about as you're going about thinking about, well, how much is this going to cost and how much do we need to be putting aside and what are our options. So what we're going to cover today, just want to make a few points about kind of to underscore why evaluation is a strategic investment. You know, I think lots of times program folks think, oh, this is just an additional expense and we don't have much money, and they don't wear the strategic investment hat. So I want to make a few comments about that. Also want to spend some time just making sure everybody's clear the things that we're going to cover today and how much things generally cost varies a lot based on what type of evaluation you're doing, whether you're using external people or internal people. So want to go over some of the details there. We'll walk through the main components of any evaluation budget. Now those basic components really are the same whether you're doing an internal evaluation or an external evaluation. And of course, if you're using outside people that are not already on your payroll, and depending on what design you have, then that generally is a more expensive evaluation. So we'll also talk about what are some ways maybe to locate some additional funding and ways that you can try to keep costs down to be more manageable but still get the advantage of external folks. And approaches for creating a budget, which is basically what I just said. So the corporation and AmeriCorps really strongly believe that evaluation by all CNCS funded programs should really be viewed as an investment and not just a compliance requirement. And you know, that's really the tone that we've had from the beginning. Like, don't just plan an evaluation to get the check off for Volunteer Florida or for AmeriCorps. It really needs to be focused on something that's going to help your program really improve itself or be able to have data that really demonstrates the effectiveness of what you're doing in the community, helping the people that you're working with or the environment, whatever you're focused on. But the reality is, it is an investment, but investments, you know, kind of implicit in that is they do cost money. And I think a lot of folks, it's easy to default into, oh, we just really can't afford it, as opposed to thinking creatively about, okay, we don't have a lot of extra money just sitting around, but how can we do this in a way that we get something meaningful that's going to be useful, but maybe piece together some things to make it more affordable, because all evaluations don't have to be huge dollar amounts, but we'll talk about kind of what are some of the ranges to kind of roughly get your brain around in a few minutes. And so sometimes it really is finding low-cost evaluation partners. That could be organizations or individuals that have evaluation expertise. Sometimes you have that in your own organization staff, not necessarily within your specific program staff, but often there's ways you can tap expertise at certain points during the evaluation process, kind of as we talked about last time, and I'll reiterate a bit of that today as well, to help keep costs down. And the reality is some funders don't actually allow you to put evaluation in your budget. CNCS actually is not one of those. That is a line item that they view as an appropriate expenditure. So trying to keep a positive mindset and really thinking about as evaluation as a strategic investment to really help move your program forward. I really want to encourage you to try to make sure you have that mindset, because as you're better able to make the case of how your program works and the good that you're doing, then you're able to attract more funders, and over time maybe you can expand your reach with partners, and all of it helps make you more sustainable. And I just want to like call out the elephant in the room here is, you know, right now our dicey times with AmeriCorps budget stuff based on the new presidential budget. You know, it's not like the Corporation for National and Community Service and AmeriCorps haven't been kind of on the chopping block many, many times in the past. I think this time it feels a little different, but there's a lot of great bipartisan support throughout the country, and a lot of organizations and people and folks on the Hill that are elected representatives all do see the value of AmeriCorps. So like, I don't want any of you to feel like doom gloomers, because I don't think we know how that's going to turn out yet. And right now is a fabulous opportunity, as AmeriCorps dollars continue to be available, to make sure that your program is as strong as possible and you have great evidence backing up your program model. And it's also a good time to be able to really make the link in your head that having this additional information about how your program works is, you're going to be able to leverage that not just for national service dollars, but there are other funders that are going to be really interested in what you're up to. And, you know, it's not always easy to find them, but if all national service programs, because of the performance measurement requirements that you all have been doing on an annual basis, plus what you learn from an evaluation, that puts your program and organization in a lot of ways several steps ahead of the average nonprofit in your community that hasn't had to maybe do that kind of data collection in the past and haven't had to figure out how their program's really doing. You all know a lot about your programs and how they work and how you benefit the people or the environment that you work with. So, you know, you're already a leg up, and what you do with evaluation is just one more piece to help you have the information to get the word out there about how great you are and why you're really necessary to keep around. So investing in evaluation, as I was just saying, pays dividends. It's not a trade-off. Oh, well, you know, if we didn't have to blow this money on evaluation, we could serve more people. Well, yes, in the short term, but what you got to have your eye on is the long-term piece. And how do you justify continuing to get funding from AmeriCorps and Volunteer Florida? And how do you have some really substantial things that you can use to approach other funders? It's all about program improvement, as we've been talking about. And as I was just saying, the things that you already know about your program from performance measurement, combined with what you learned from doing either a process or impact evaluation, is a real differentiator that makes your program stand out, especially in this environment that we're in these days of scarce resources and accountability. You all are already a bit ahead of the curve on that, which is just a great place to be, and make sure you realize that and take full advantage of it. So the corporation really likes to emphasize, and I agree with them, that the evaluation that you do now is part of a long-term strategy, a long-term research agenda that you have to really make sure that your program is as strong as possible and achieving the impacts that you've been set up to do. So what do you, like, for those of you that are doing your first evaluation plan now, you know, it's always a bit of a trade-off, as we've been talking about. Okay, so what do you look at first? And, you know, it's often that you want to do some kind of process evaluation to make sure your model is being implemented with fidelity across sites in a really strong way. And then often, like a later phase, is looking at outcomes and impact and having a comparison group or a control group. I mean, if you jump right into that first without knowing that your model is being implemented in a similar way, sometimes it's really hard to know what the data actually means because you don't fully understand how your program is implemented. So evaluation about your program, you know, does go on a continuum. Every 3 years, you're in a position where you get to think about, all right, for the next chunk, what are you going to look at? Are you going to look at the same thing? You're going to see how things have improved? Or you're going to drill down in a different component of your program? All of this evaluation is an investment in the long-term improvement of all pieces of what you and your members are doing. So in the last webinar, we talked about how to use external evaluators and where do you find them. So I want to revisit a couple of points we made last month because I think it informs what we're talking about today around budgeting. So when to use an internal versus an external evaluator was something we talked about in the last webinar, and really that's based on 4 basic buckets of considerations. One are the requirements of Volunteer Florida and the Corporation for National and Community Service. Over a certain size, you're required to do an external impact evaluation. Under a certain size, you can do an external impact evaluation, or it is allowable to do an internal process evaluation. It all depends on what your needs are and what you're trying to do. If you're trying to beef up your program model, that's kind of one snapshot. If you're looking to build evidence, then you're going to be leaning towards doing some kind of impact evaluation. So the evaluation type influences when to use an internal or an external person, the resources your organization has, and what your internal staff capacity is. If you're a relatively small organization, but there's nobody in your program or organization that has evaluation background, even if you don't have to use an external person, it may be really in your best interest to figure out how to be able to tap some expertise outside the organization to help make sure that you don't waste a lot of time designing an evaluation that at the end of the day is not going to be able to answer the questions that you have. But as soon as you start thinking about bringing in external people, that's an additional resource demand. Sometimes you can find pro bono or low-cost services, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But to make sure it's done right, there's pretty much always an additional cost to that in some sort of way. So you just need to have that in mind. It's the reality of what it takes to do a good job on this. So process evaluations, I think, generally are cheaper to do because you're collecting data about what's going on around implementation of your model, and there's ways to do that that often you're already collecting some of that information. So to get the additional things you need, maybe you add a few questions onto an existing survey or data collection tool. When you start moving into impact evaluation, and you really have to think about what's a sample size that's going to have statistical significance at the end of the day when you're comparing it with your intervention group, with your comparison group, that's a whole other ball of wax. And those are more labor intensive and require often more external assistance to help make sure you're doing it right. And at the end of the day, your results mean something. So staff capacity and expertise in evaluation is also like one piece of this. Some of your organizations, I know from our conversations, have pretty strong internal people that are available to help plan this out and then actually do it. Some of the rest of you, this is a newer area for you, and staff are building their capacity to actually do this. And this webinar series is actually a piece of the professional development you're getting to equip you with the skills you need to do it in the future. Excuse me. So as we talked about, and I just want to underscore this, when resources are limited, the best way to use either an internal or especially an external evaluator's time is to get guidance on the front end on how do you design your evaluation. Those of you that are in the cycle right now, you've had the benefit that Volunteer Florida secured my time to help you talk through what your options are and come up with a plan that really fits where you are in the development of your program. And those of you that are going to be moving into this but are not there yet, this is actually a really great place to make an investment, is on the front end, to make sure that the evaluation that you have planned really reaps you what you want. Having somebody help with data analysis is also a really good evaluation expenditure, especially if that's not your favorite thing, or if you don't really know how to do it. And I still, because I haven't done much of this lately, I have to look up the difference between, all right, when to use a chi-square versus a t-test versus regression analysis, and what are the steps for those again? I mean, there's people that do that every single day that can be extremely helpful in helping you figure out what your data means. And then also having somebody help write a final report is also a great place to spend some resources to get an outside person to help you, because they can see patterns in the data and pull things together, and they bring a set of new eyes and objectivity to figuring out what your evaluation results really are, that sometimes if you've done it internally, you may be too close to it and interpreting data through your own lens. So having an outside person kind of push you and say, what do you think this means, and did you think about it this way, can be very helpful. So according to the corporation, this is straight out of their presentation in the Evaluation Core curriculum that you can get on the Knowledge Network. Evaluation budgets, it's the stuff we've just been talking about. They need to be appropriate for the design you're using and what kind of questions you're answering. They should be adequate to make sure that it's a quality evaluation and it's done with rigor, so in some systematic way, so that you know the data actually means what you want it to mean, and in line with the level of resources you have available. It's like if you have $5,000 to spend on your evaluation, you don't want to plan an evaluation that should be worth $50,000, because that's a mismatch, and you won't be able to find a quality organization or person to do it. So sometimes you have to kind of work all sides at once to figure out the budgeting piece. So program factors affect the budget. So if and I know some of you are, your program works sort of within a county or city limits, or at least in a region that's relatively, the sites are relatively close to each other. Some of you that have programs that are spread out throughout the state of Florida, you know, it's harder to get between sites, and I mean, it takes time and it takes money to be able to do that and include all of the various sites in a design. The design itself, whether you're doing a control group or a comparison group or some kind of pre-post or other type of non-experimental design, that makes a big difference in terms of how much it costs. And the corporation always puts in, when they're thinking about budgeting for evaluation, this whole last piece on reporting, dissemination, and use. And I think when a lot of programs think about how much is it going to cost to do the evaluation, they don't actually really consider this as one of the expenses that you need to think about. If the expectation is you're going to share that more broadly and you're going to print up a report, like, you got to think about some of that stuff on the front end, because then the budget you're putting together is a little more comprehensive. I think a lot of people sort of stop short of this, and I'm not saying you always have to include this, but just realize that this is a piece that you want to keep on your radar, and especially if you're going to take the data and use it in some different ways, and you've got a different kind of report that you want to be able to do, like the full meal deal report that gets used internally, versus maybe you want to have a one-pager that kind of gives the highlights of what the evaluation did and what it showed with some nice pictures. You know, that's going to cost something. Some of you have departments in your organizations, if you're big enough, that do that stuff for you. But you know that if not, you may have to have additional resources to make that piece happen. So it's just another category that I think a lot of folks don't think about. So CNCS has done some research looking at kind of what's up in the evaluation field, how much are federally funded grant programs spending on evaluation. And you know, for years, evaluators, and I'm one of them, talking to programs when they ask, well, how much should we think about allocating for an evaluation? Rule of thumb, I always say, like, you know, 5, 7, 10%. Well, what CNCS has been saying, based on their recent look at things, is that may be too simplistic, and for some kinds of evaluation, that's not enough. That number's too low. However, I do think if you have absolutely no idea where to start, that's still not a bad, you know, especially 5, 7, 10. Those three, like, that's not a bad place to start. But don't get too wedded to that. You have to then think about all the chunks of what needs to happen, and we'll go through that in a minute. There's some administrative data that's available already that you can tap into that help reduce the cost, because you don't actually have to collect it. So something like that might be test scores for third grade reading. Schools and districts have that data. They collect it anyway. So if you can get access to that, that saves you time in having to come up with a parallel system to collect something that is actually valid and reliable on your own. So that can help keep the costs down. And I think there's more and more examples of programs having data sharing agreements with other organizations so that they can access some data without having to do it themselves. The Social Innovation Fund, which is one of the programs funded through CNCS, has a huge evaluation requirement that's built into what those grants do. And they all have to move up into the moderate or strong evidence level at the end of their 5-year grant. They have to have very rigorous evaluations, and those reports are starting to be released. So there's some great information about how they were designed, but then you can also see, well, how much did they have to budget for something of that scale? That's probably beyond what a lot of you are going to be doing, but for some of you that are larger organizations, there can be some great learning from checking out some of those SIF reports. And there is a section, I'll just quickly mention, on the corporation's website that's called the evidence, evidence sharing piece. And so that's a place where a lot of organizations are starting to post up their evaluation reports. I know I found a few this week that I sent out to some of you because I thought they might be useful. It's a great way to look at it. Also, a trend is building the evaluation, especially an impact evaluation, off some of the things you already collect as performance measurement. Not to be confused that evaluation and performance measurement are the same thing, but you can use that data and build upon it as part of your evaluation design. So the corporation did a study looking at a bunch of federally funded grant program reports, and they broke out this chart, and this was interesting because I hadn't really seen these kind of numbers before, but I thought I would just share it with you because I think it gives you some sense of the range. As I just mentioned, a lot of times the 5 to 10% number is the one that has traditionally been tossed around, and AmeriCorps and CNCS are making the case that, well, that may not be enough. Well, in their research they looked at non-experimental designs, which could include process evaluations, or when there's a comparison between pre and post tests like you do already for your performance measurement, many of you, and looking at budget averages for the size of the program and how much they spend on evaluation. The non-experimental ones were budgeting about 16% of their total budget size for evaluation. Where there's a comparison group, it was about the same, 16%. But what I want you to see is when you jump up to having a control group, which is the random assignment piece that most of you are not going to be doing, that is a much more labor-intensive process. And so the average that was being spent for those kind of evaluations was closer to 25% of the total budget. Now, I don't want these numbers to freak you out and have you think there's just no way that we can possibly spend that much on evaluation. Our grant isn't that big. We don't have other sources of funding to help pay for that. We're going to talk about that more in a few minutes. But I want you to have a realistic sense that evaluation isn't something that you can just sort of slide in on the cheap, and it does take additional resources. And you have to think about that because it does affect what's doable in terms of your evaluation planning. So there's some common places to look for resources, and that could be money to help you pay for an evaluation once you've come up with the budget, or it may be people that can provide pro bono services or reduced cost services. So there's local resources. So local partners that your organization already has may be willing to work with you either in a low-cost way or provide pro bono services. I know one of the Florida programs right now is having a school district that's partnering with them for the evaluation. It's a district that they work in. They do great evaluations all the time, and they're going to do the evaluation of the program for free, basically, which is an amazing gift. And there's also local universities, community colleges, cooperative extension, and local consultants. So joint evaluation activities, that's really the one I was just talking about with the school district. And then there are some foundations that fund evaluations specifically. So you see a couple of those listed there. Annie E. Casey is one that I've worked with on some things. And, you know, I think a lot of times people assume all foundation dollars are just for programmatic activities, but there are some foundations that really believe in the value of building evidence and strengthening nonprofit capacity. So they do grants to fund evaluation specifically. So then it's, you know, what kind of money do you have? Is it restricted? Some funders say you can't spend their money on evaluation. And if you have unrestricted dollars, then of course you get to choose where you put those dollars. So, you know, a lot of organizations love unrestricted money because then they can use that for direct services, or they can use it for operational or administrative costs, and evaluation could be one of those. So one thing to keep in mind is, as you're getting ready to set out your budget for an evaluation, is that it's really likely going to look different for each of the 3 years. So make sure you think about that. Depending how you're planning to do your evaluation, you know, year one, once you have your initial evaluation plan accepted by Volunteer Florida, in year one of the next cycle, that's the year that you're expected to take your sort of preliminary plan that was in your recompete and build that out into a revised plan that's got more meat, and it's really the thing that gets implemented. And that includes designing your data collection tools and processes, making sure you get folks on board that are going to do it, collect the data for you, all of that. Year two is often data collection. That's not always the case. Some of you are starting data collection in year one. Some of you are not going to start till next year. Some of you are going to do both years. And then year three, because it's actually a short year, that's generally speaking all about the analysis of the data, the compiling of it, the cleaning of it, figuring out what it means, and then writing the report. So depending, one example is maybe year one, because you're only planning, might be less money needed in your budget, because year two is the implementation piece. Maybe that's going to cost more depending on what your data collection plan looks like. And then reporting and analysis, that always takes a ton of time. So like year three, that's not like you're on the downhill slide. You got to make sure that you've put enough in a budget to cover actually figuring out what to do with the data that you collect. I would say some of you, year one is actually going to be a bigger year because you're going to maybe be working with an external evaluator to come up with a plan, develop your tools, and maybe some of the data collection itself is going to happen as part of your ongoing operations of the program. So it might actually cost you less to collect the data. You might need more money in year one and year three than year two. So there's no one right answer to this. It really depends on what you're doing, who you're working with, and some of the things we're going to talk about shortly here about what are the different categories to think about. But just know that you have to have some sense of how's it going to flow based on the timeline of when different activities are going to happen and how labor intensive you think those are going to be. So we've been talking about who's going to conduct it, and that influences the budget. What is the evaluation going to include? How are you going to collect the data? Who's going to manage it? And how you're going to get the results out there. And as I said a few minutes ago, we're going to go through each of these categories. The categories are actually the same for internal and external. Of course, if you're doing it internally, that generally is going to be a lot less cost associated with it, but you still need to think through all the categories to make sure there's not some expense that you didn't think of that could negatively affect the implementation of your evaluation when you're kind of midstream. So there's basically 5 components to an evaluation budget. It's evaluation staff and subcontractor consultant time, travel associated with the data collection piece, other direct costs, overhead, and program costs to support the evaluation. And just want to say, and we'll go through each of these, but just because you may have evaluation staff, whether that's consultants or internal folks doing the evaluation, that doesn't mean that other people associated with the program are not going to have to dedicate part of their time to be interviewed, help collect data or something. So you need to kind of think through the implications of all of these categories. So, and I realized after I sent it out, I didn't attach it, but I will send you a follow-up email to this webinar that has the Excel spreadsheet. And when you signed in to the GoToWebinar site, it is up there in the handouts download, so you can get it that way. But I put together an evaluation budget worksheet that's in Excel. This is the summary page, and then there's some other sheets in the worksheet that go through each of these categories and help you think about, for year 1, 2, 3, what might the costs look like. So this is what the cover sheet looks like. So you will have this as a tool. Hopefully it's helpful to trigger your thoughts on, okay, have we thought about all the things that might be associated with the evaluation in terms of what it is really going to cost us. So last time we did talk a bit about hourly rates for external evaluators. And I don't want to get too hung up on, okay, when is somebody a subject matter expert versus a technical staff person. But just know that there's, especially when you hire external folks, they often have a team that people play different roles in. I know, for example, when I get evaluation contracts for my company, you know, I serve as like senior researcher, overseer, manager, and then I hire folks to help me with data collection and maybe with data analysis, sometimes with report writing, but I often end up doing that. So it's not always that you're going to see big differences in hourly rates for different kinds of roles, but do know that depending on who you decide to work with, that may be the case. And what I think you can see from this chart is that working with independent standalone consulting firms, that's what they do, is research and evaluation, is generally more expensive than working with folks from a university. That's not always the case, but I'd say rule of thumb, that's true. And you can see on the screen here that, you know, sometimes it can be almost double the price for an hour to have somebody from a private consulting firm versus a university. So when you're thinking about labor costs, I think there's a couple ways in on this. One is thinking about what are the basic tasks, what kind of people might be able to do that task, and what's kind of the going rate for that level person. So like an assistant, somebody that maybe is doing data entry or sending out emails, arranging interviews, likely they're going to cost less than somebody that is either an evaluation technical specialist, or if you're, say, an education program and you want to have somebody that's an education evaluation researcher specialist, those people are going to cost more than an assistant. So you kind of estimate how many days you think it's going to be, how much they cost, and that gives you some sense of what the staffing labor costs are. I think this is actually a really hard piece. Because it's so hard to know. There's so many variables. And like I always find it really difficult when I put together a proposal to an organization. You know, you have to put in a budget, like there's a timeline with all the tasks, and then there's a budget. And so I always am looking to make sure that what I say the tasks are need to align with what the budget looks like. And this is a tricky piece, but this is an area where it's really something, especially if you're working with outside people, that's negotiable. So if you're doing an internal evaluation, you may not be trying to figure out what it's going to cost to get an outside person, but I do think it's important to try to roughly think about how much time are each of the major chunks of an evaluation, how long is it going to take, because certain pieces take a lot more time. So here's an example from an evaluation that I did for a national direct program that had 30 sites around the country. So that isn't any of you, but I thought it could be useful for you to see sort of the thought process behind this. So like I broke out the major categories of activity, and I really tried to think about, based on what it would take to do that, how many days might it take to make it happen. And then, because I was an outside person, I added in operating costs and overhead. But you know, I think the front-end development often can take more time, depending on how extensive your data collection is. If you're collecting a lot of data that's not things that you normally collect on an ongoing basis, and this could include comparison group data. Sometimes the data collection piece, if you're doing interviews or something, that's time consuming. So sometimes it takes more time to collect the data than it does to plan it, look at the literature, see what you can learn from that, and actually design the instruments. The data aggregation and analysis, I think sometimes people can lowball how much time this takes. It takes a decent amount. Often it's more than the planning end. So like in this example, I put in 10 days, and then I put in 10 days for report preparation and debrief. So in actuality, those two categories kind of run together, because I know when I'm actually doing it, it's like I'll process a piece of data and then I'll write up what it means, and then I'll move on to the next thing. But these two chunks together, you got to make sure there's enough time built in, either with your staff if you're doing it internally, or there's enough time with an external evaluator to make sure that this piece happens really well. Because at the end of the day, even if you collect all the data, you had a good design, if it doesn't get analyzed right and the report isn't written up in a quality way, you've wasted kind of a lot of time. So we just talked about some things to think about around staffing. So travel, that's okay. If you're not, like if you're all within the same city limits, then this is not a big deal. Although if you're hiring an external evaluator, they may want mileage for going around to different sites to do observations or interviews or whatever. Chances are good most of you are not going to have airfare or train tickets or any of that. So, excuse me, your travel expense piece may be small, if anything. The next category are other direct costs. So if the person either internally or externally is going to be doing interviews or online focus groups or discussions, then you have to, maybe your organization already has conference call lines they can use. Maybe you have to use something like GoToWebinar that we use for these webinars. But you know, there's a cost with that sometimes. If your organization already has it and you're doing an internal one, then as long as you can access it for the evaluation, there's no additional cost. You got to think about, even if you do it internally, if you're going to mail out some kind of survey. I think these days a lot of things are done online. So the postage and printing and mailing is less of an issue. But think about it, like, are you going to need to print materials to hand out to your members about how to collect the data in a consistent way? There may be things you need to print, and again, if that's already part of your budget, it may not be a separate line item you need to think about, but you need to kind of know in your head that the evaluation is going to take a chunk out of your existing budget if you're going to need to do any printing and mailing. There's other supplies and equipment that you might need for data collection. So are you going to need to use an online survey platform? And I have put together a sheet that should have come out in the email I sent before that goes through the top 4 survey platforms that a lot of smaller organizations use, like nonprofits, and goes through kind of what are the features of all of them and how much do they cost. So I know sometimes people think, oh, well, that's going to be more expensive than just doing paper and pencil kind of stuff. So one consideration here is there may be a cost for it, but as you'll see on the sheet, which looks like this, pretty much everybody offers a free version. And so depending on who you're collecting data from, how many different surveys you need, what do the numbers look like, you may be able to use an online system like this for free. And the upside of that, and even if you have to pay, I'm a big believer of these, like SurveyMonkey, Survey Gizmo, those are like the 2 Cadillacs, but the other 2 also are very good. It saves you a lot of time in the analysis stage, because when you have like multiple choice questions or rating scales, it will calculate the averages for you. Any open-ended questions where people had to type things in, you still have to manually do that, but at least you're not wasting time trying to figure out what the heck somebody's handwriting is trying to tell you. So there's an upfront expense associated, perhaps, with, depending on your needs, with using one of these, but it actually saves you, I'd say, a bunch of money in the long run. If you don't have meeting space, you might have to rent it if you're going to do a focus group. If you're going to buy data sets, or if you're going to buy some existing tool that's been proven to be reliable and valid in situations like yours, I mean, there's a cost to those things. If you're going to record focus groups or interviews, you may need voice recorders. You know, you can do a lot with apps on a phone or an iPad these days. And there are some software packages that do voice to text. So my experience here, because as you all remember, my wrist was immobilized in a cast for 2 months, I looked at a lot of voice to text software, and it wasn't always all that good in terms of coming up with the right words, and I kind of gave up on that. But a thing that I've used a lot in the past is, if you haven't heard of it, it's called Fiverr with 2 R's.com, and you can go in, and I've had a lot of transcripts done. It's often somebody in the Philippines or somewhere, and for $5 they will transcribe and do a pretty decent job for like 20 minutes, 15 minutes worth of recording time. So at the end of the day, yes, you could type it up yourself, but sometimes spending like 15 or 20 bucks for an hour's worth of recording to have somebody else type it up and then you just do a buff and shine on it, that could be a great time saver for you, and it's relatively low cost. I often try several different transcriptionists that are active on Fiverr at one time, see who does the best job, and then I put all my stuff over to that one in the future. So that's just a little tip. So another thing that I think lots of times nonprofits don't think about related to budgeting, and I think this happens, it's more of a consideration if you're using external folks, is what's the overhead cost that the organization uses. And so you need to ask questions about this, because say you had $6,000 for an evaluation. When it's run through certain organizations, depending on their overhead rate, that may automatically take out a chunk. So you may think you're going to get $6,000 worth of somebody's time, and sometimes you might be, but other times, depending on overhead rates, you actually are getting a chunk less for somebody's time. So this is an area to ask some questions about, because overhead rates can vary a lot. They're often in the 20% range to sometimes, especially private consulting firms, they can charge like 110% of a consultant's time as their overhead for the privilege of processing the stuff with the evaluator. So you really need to ask about this. So I did some quick look on the internet to try to get some sense. It seems like in Florida, kind of a going rate for a lot of your universities is in the 26% category related to off-campus research. But again, this is something to talk about. Like, I'm not 100% sure that they always charge this every single time, but these are the numbers that I could come up with doing a Google search. But notice Boston University, you know, they're almost 64% overhead. So if you've got 100 bucks, 64 of those dollars are going to help Boston University keep their doors open and the lights on, and only 40% of $40 of that 100 is going to go to actually doing the work. So make sure you ask about that. You also have to think about what are the costs internally to your program to support the evaluation, because program staff may need to meet with the evaluator. So you have to have some rough idea of how much time you have available or you can make available to do evaluation activities. Like, I know, especially for those of you that are doing internal evaluation, this is a tough one to guesstimate. But I encourage you to, even if you say, oh, well, the evaluation, we're going to do it all internally, so the budget is zero, realize the cash outlay to somebody outside may be zero, but there's still a cost in terms of how you're using internal program resources. And so just be cognizant of that and have some idea of, like, if you're already working, 60 hours a week, you got to think about what are you going to be able to cut back if you to do the additional activities associated with an evaluation, because pretty much always they're it's gonna take extra time, even if you're building on existing processes you already have in place. So, if your executive director has to be involved, like at the bottom of this chart, if there's an AmeriCorps program manager, if you're paying site supervisors to do something, like there's, even if you're not putting out extra money for it, there is an internal cost. So I encourage you to be realistic about that and have some sense about what that means, because in a way it's part of what you're putting in terms of match costs or pro bono, however you want to look at that. So I do think it's good to, if you can, kind of come up with a range. I know I was talking to one of the Florida programs this week, and while the program hasn't done an evaluation on itself, the department and the organization that they're housed in have done similar kinds of evaluations. So that was great because he knew right away, okay, this is roughly what we know we've spent in the past to do similar evaluations. So then, you know, sometimes what you have to do is when you have the dollar figure first, you're working backwards on some of these things we've just talked about. If you truly have no clue about how much it's going to cost and how much money you need to try to pull in from different sources, then you kind of have to do the add it all up, see where you get to, and then figure out where to find the resources. Some of you are going to be doing it the other way around, where we know this is all we have, and then you kind of have to backtrack and figure out what's realistic and make sure if you're spending X amount, say it's $6,000, that you've thought about what does that look like over each of 3 years and for the different tasks, and make sure you leave enough resources in there to do the analysis and reporting piece, because that's just so critical. So good, fast, and cheap, yeah, maybe you can find that, but doesn't always exist. So some quick challenges, because I know we're getting down there on time. Sometimes if you use students, you know, there's continuity issues. Sometimes, you know, your people don't have the evaluation background to get things set up right and collected in to make sure it's high quality data. Maybe the design wasn't strong enough to actually answer your questions. So cheap is not always better. Sometimes it's better to figure out how to pull in resources from other places to help you do it. So, you know, even organizations that get hired out to do evaluations sometimes do pro bono projects. Now, I often do one pro bono evaluation for a nonprofit in the Metro Denver area every year, in addition to what I do, you know, for work. You know, using existing data, building on that. There's lots of ways to try to minimize how much this costs, but just be careful not to like overly make it too cheap, because then you won't have anything you're proud of and you'll have done a lot of work that doesn't actually help you. So using existing data and then building on that, building data collection into ongoing things that members are filling out or site supervisors, that can be a great way to get stuff by adding a few extra questions on something that's happening anyway, because that doesn't take a ton more time on anybody's time. So CNCS put together, and don't worry, we're wrapping it down here, an example. So for an evaluation, when they added it all up, they figured the event, so this is for a big program, and most of you are never going to think in the immediate term that you're going to spend $200,000 on an evaluation. But what you have to think about is, okay, what are the sources of funds that you have? What kind are they? Are they restricted or unrestricted? So like in the case of this example, a program had a state grant of $100,000, which allowed them to use up to 5% for evaluation. So that was $5,000. They had a foundation grant that was unrestricted, so they could, $150,000 of that could go towards the evaluation. Then some amount came from their CNCS grant. So you kind of have to look at how, once you have a figure, especially if you're doing the adding it up sort of approach, to figure out how do you piece together money from different pots. And are there other ways to shift costs out? Like maybe there's still some costs associated with it, but you've gotten some pro bono expertise to help you get it planned. And all you have to do is hire somebody to help you analyze it and maybe help write the report. You draft it, they look at the data, and they edit. I mean, so I think there's lots of creative ways to make this more manageable. So there's some resources that the corporation liked that deal specifically with budgeting. Social Innovation Fund, that's funded by CNCS, because they have such a huge emphasis on evaluation, there's actually a lot of materials about how to do budgeting. Remember, when you're looking at those, though, the bar on evaluation for those grants is really, really high. That doesn't mean there's not good insights into how you do budgeting for AmeriCorps programs in that. And then there's some other things. So I know we're out of time. If anybody has any quick questions, you can type them in chat. If you've got to go, I completely understand. And if there's anything else that you have as a question about anything related to evaluation, including budgeting, and I know some of you are getting ready to turn in your grant application later this week, so please feel free to email me any questions you have, and I'm glad to answer your question via email, or we can get on the phone. Sometimes that's easier to just quickly talk through how to think about budgeting. So just to reiterate, if you're doing an external evaluation, I think in some ways it may be easier to come up with a dollar figure of what an evaluation is going to cost. I think there's the tendency, if you're doing an internal evaluation, to assume it's kind of free and that a budget's not required. So while it may not take additional dollars, I think you do need to think about how you can reallocate time and other things within the budget you already have to be able to pull off the evaluation and perhaps make some sort of estimate or address that in some kind of narrative way in your evaluation plan that's going to go to Volunteer Florida. So thanks again for being here today, and good luck with all of this. And again, if you have any questions, please, please, please send me an email, and I'll get right on it. Have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.